everyone. In my last video, we talked about cost of debt under the topic cost of capital. In this video, we will be talking about cost of preference shares. I repeat, when we talk about a capital structure of a company, what do we think of? We think of owner's fund and borrowed funds, that is equity and debt. When we talk about equity shares and preference shares, we are talking about equity, that is owner's fund. But as I said, friends, nothing comes for free, whether it is owner's fund or borrowed fund. A cost is associated to each type of fund. So let us talk about how to calculate the cost of preference shares. But before we proceed with cost of preference shares or talking about the cost associated to it, let us understand what are preference shares. So preference shares are the share capital in the form of preference share capital issued by any company to the investors. Now, how do we differentiate between equity shares and preference shares? Preference shares gets dividend which is fixed in nature. Equity shares gets dividend which is fluctuating in nature. So let's say a company has issued 10% preference share or 11% preference share. So how much will the investor get? 10% on the preference share investment, 11% on the preference share investment, right? So what is the cost which we can directly see associated to preference share is 10% and 11% for the company. Let us talk about mathematically also how to calculate the cost of preference shares. Again, preference shares can be redeemable in nature, preference share can be irredeemable in nature. I'm just going to tell you the fundamental calculation and the basic difference between the calculation of redeemable preference shares and irredeemable preference shares. To proceed with, let's talk about redeemable preference shares. My dear friends, we also connote preference shares as KP. What was the connotation of cost of debt? In the last video which we studied, it was KD. For preference shares, we write KP for the cost of preference shares. Now, when we talk about irredeemable shares, the formula is very simple. What do we pay to the preference shareholders? Do we pay interest? The answer is loud and clear, no. Interest is paid on debt. Then what is paid to the shareholders or what is paid on share capital? So on share capital, what the company pays is dividend. And the dividend paid to preference shareholders is known as preference dividend. So the formula is very simple. For redeemable preference shares, preference dividend upon P0. So what is this P0? P0 is the price of the shares, the amount received by the company after issuing the preference shares. For example, a company issued preference shares having face value of 100 at a discount of 10 rupees, that is 90. So what is the P0? The P0 is 90. Right? And let's say that the preference shares was 10% preference shares. So what will be the cost on 90? 10% of 90 will be the preference dividend. Remember one thing, any discount, any flotation cost has to be deducted, and in P0 we only write the amount received. So very simple. The cost associated to preference share is preference dividend divided by the amount received by issuing preference shares. Coming to the next formula, that is cost of preference shares which are redeemable in nature. How do we discriminate between redeemable and irredeemable? Irredeemable means which is not to be returned after a stipulated period of time. The fund remains with the company for a long time till the existence of the company. Redeemable means where the investment is done for a stipulated period of time. Preference shareholder ने अपना पैसा डाला है for 5 years, for 10 years or for 15 years. So your N is very specifically determined and defined while calculating cost of preference shares for redeemable preference shares, right? Let's have a look at the formula. Definitely preference dividend is the cost of preference shares. So PD plus RV minus amount received upon amount received plus RV divided by 2. What do we mean by that? So preference dividend plus redeemable value minus amount received. What is this redeemable value? If the company has issued preference shares today at 100 rupees, but after 5 years, when it will be redeemed, when the repayment will be done, the repayment will be done at 100 rupees. So the redeemable value becomes 100 and the price at which it is issued, the amount received becomes 90. Divided by amount received plus redeemable value divided by 2. Now what does this stands for? This is nothing but the average price of the preference shares. So how do we calculate the average price of the preference share? Amount received by issuing the preference shares. Let's say a company received 50 lakhs, right? So 50 lakhs is the amount received plus redeemable value. Let's say the redeemable value after 5 years would be 60 lakhs. So 50 lakhs plus 60 lakhs divided by 2. So very simply, for redeemable and irredeemable, this is how we calculate the cost of preference shares, also known as KP.